So, two things you should know about me. I love medieval history, and I love the Black Death. Or, well, disease history in general, but mostly the plague. Also, cannibalism. I tend to cover that a lot, so maybe three things. But at the intersection of medieval history and the Black Death is the story of Joan, Princess of England, daughter of the Plantagenet King Edward III, whose death changed the fate of Europe's royal families and maybe even the 100 Years' War. So let's learn about Joan. Who was she? What was life like for her? How and why did she contract the plague? And what were the bigger ramifications of her death? Joan was the daughter of Edward III, Plantagenet King of England from 1327 until 1377, so a solid 50-year reign. The Plantagenets more broadly ruled from 1154 with Henry II until 1485 with the death of Richard III, a very controversial character popularized and exaggerated by William Shakespeare's play of the same name. I'm going to be putting out a full-length podcast episode on him later this year after I go to England and visit Bosworth Hill where he died in the spring. It's going to be really fun. Now, the Plantagenets had some really famous rulers. You've got Richard the Lionheart, his brother John, who is the same one from Robin Hood legend, by the way, and their father, the first Plantagenet king, Henry II. He passed a series of legal reforms that established common law, something most of us abide by in the Western world, a legal system based on judicial decisions and cases. But there were 14 Plantagenet kings, and this isn't the space to talk about them all. There's no time for tangents in an half-out mini. Now, for the bulk of the 14th century, that's the 1300s, England was ruled by Edward III, and he had a lot going on. For one, the 100 Years' War began during his reign. Relations between the French and English were already pretty shaky, but Edward, in a really bold move,
It's a bold strategy, Cotton. Let's see if it pays off for him.
claimed the entire French throne as his inheritance. He had a claim through his mother's family, Queen Isabella, who was sister to the French King Charles IV, who died in 1328 without a male heir. But it didn't go to Edward, obviously, and a long story short and simplified, after some back and forths, England and France went to war over English claims to French lands. It was a conflict that lasted from 1337 to 1453, so not 100 years, and was eventually won by the French. Perhaps a story for another day. And I promise, this is all relevant to Joan. I'm not on a tangent. Not this time. So oftentimes, in these European ruling families, there are political marriages. This would be especially important in times of war. Edward would want to make sure his daughter married into a family that could provide some sort of strategic advantage. And this wasn't just an England thing. All of Europe's ruling families did this. In 1336, Joan was to marry one of the Austrian Habsburg lords. It was an agreement between King Edward III and Otto, the Duke of Austria. And Joan was only around 2 at the time, which is wild, thinking about marrying off your 2-year-old daughter. She was born sometime between December 1333 and late January 1334, so her age varies in different sources if you've heard a different age. Now, the idea was that she would stay in Austria, grow up there, get an education, and when she was of age, marry into the Habsburg family. But Edward III was reluctant to send her off so soon. It took 3 years of convincing, but Joan eventually traveled to Austria. It was 1339, so she would have been around 5 or 6. But around the same time, Otto, Duke of Austria, died. He's the one that King Edward made that initial agreement with, right? So King Edward thought that the new Duke of Austria was about to ally with his enemy, the French, so he called off the betrothal and brought his daughter Joan back to England. A few years go by. Joan is now 11, and her father decides to marry her off to Peter of Castile, son of Maria of Portugal and Alfonso of Castile. Why? It was a strong political move. Perhaps through the Castilians, the English could find allies in their fight against the French. After all, with England to the north and Castile to the south, they could squeeze France in. The Plantagenets already had some links to the Castilians through previous marriages, so it was a good match, not too outlandish of an idea. It's 1345, and Joan is still a bit too young, but by the summer of 1348, her parents bid her farewell. She was sent off with a pretty well-armored convoy for protection, as she would have to cross through France to get to Castile. The first leg of the trip would be by boat, though. Joan was going to make a pit stop at the Plantagenet family castle in Bordeaux, right in the heart of French wine country. It's important to mention, for context, that Bordeaux and that whole chunk of France there on the edge was ruled by the Plantagenets until the end of the Hundred Years' War, when France kicked the English out of the mainland and annexed the entire region. So Joan was going to leave the safety of England, head into enemy territory to visit family lands, and then eventually work her way south down into Castile. And she started this journey in 1348. But do you know what else was happening in Europe in 1348? The Black Death. The plague wasn't widespread in England yet, but it sure was wreaking havoc in mainland Europe. It arrived in 1347 in Messina, Sicily, and spread into Europe from there. It's very likely the English crown knew of the plague, but wasn't that aware of the dangers since it wasn't rampant in England by early 1348, or at the very least, the English crown underestimated it. So Edward sent his 14 or 15-year-old daughter Joan into danger. Sure, she had men to protect her from bandits or from the French, but they couldn't protect her from the plague. What could have protected her was not wandering around through the disease-ridden country. But hindsight. So Joan and her escort sailed for Bordeaux. The plan was to disembark there and then travel south after a little bit of, they're going to visit the family lands and retool, and then they'll go south. But when the ship arrived, the mayor of Bordeaux was anxiously waiting for them. The town was in the throes of plague, and he warned them not to get off here. It wasn't safe. You're going to get sick and die. Don't come here. Go away. Shoo. Just leave. But unfortunately for the English, they didn't heed the mayor's warning and got off the boat anyway. Now, Dan Jones, in his book, The Plantagenets, the Warrior Kings and Queens Who Made England, one of my favorite history books of all time, by the way. Really good stuff. You should read it. He describes it really well. Quote, "The royal party had come from a country as yet untouched by the scourge that had ravaged the rest of Europe. They brushed the mayor and his warnings aside. The English party believed God had granted them so many victories since 1340, perhaps the princess and her advisors also believed they might be spared this latest threat." End quote. The biggest victory in question was the 1346 victory at the Battle of Crécy, an important English win and one of the major battles of the Hundred Years' War. But it didn't matter how divine they felt for defeating the French 2 years prior. The plague doesn't care if you're English or French, if you're a royal or a peasant, and it didn't take long for the landing party to contract the plague. The first person died on August 20th, and Joan was whisked away to the nearby village of Loremo, hoping she'd be safe there. But of course, she wasn't. She had already come in contact with someone infected with the plague, and it was too late. And she died a quick, violent death on September 2nd, 1348. She was the first royal to die from the Black Death, but not the only one. In fact, Alfonso of Castile, the king and the father of the boy she was sent to marry, he later died of plague in 1350. Almost 2 weeks after her death, grieving Father Edward, King of England, sends a letter to Alfonso breaking the bad news, and here's an excerpt from that letter. Quote, "We are sure that your magnificence knows how, after much complicated negotiation about the intended marriage of the renowned Prince Peter, your eldest son, and our most beloved daughter, Joan, which was designed to nurture perpetual peace and create an indissoluble union between our royal houses, we sent our said daughter to Bordeaux en route for your territories in Castile. But see, with what intense bitterness of heart we have to tell you this, destructive death, who seizes young and old alike, sparing no one and reducing rich and poor to the same level, has lamentably snatched from both of us our dearest daughter." End quote. Edward was very fond of Joan and was crushed by her death. In fact, on Edward III's tomb in Westminster Abbey, you can see a small bronze statuette of Joan. The Westminster Abbey claims that Joan is buried at Bayonne Cathedral in Bayonne, France, not New Jersey, but I've seen other sources that claim we don't know where her cremated remains are interred. But either way, Edward couldn't get her body back home to England, even if he wanted to. She was infected, and those who died of plague had to be disposed of immediately. With Joan died the potential alliance between England and Castile. Could their marriage have helped England in the war against France? There's a good possibility that it might have, but of course that's just speculation because it ended up never happening. So it's one of those fun what-ifs of history that people like to think about. But honestly, Peter wasn't that much of a catch. Not that great of a guy, turns out. Peter went on to become the King of Castile and Leon from 1350 to 1369, just 2 years after Joan's death when his father also died of plague. But he earned the moniker Peter the Cruel over his tenure as king for a variety of reasons. Here's some juicy gossip from his personal life. He secretly married one woman, Maria, but then was forced to marry another, Blanche. You know, political marriages, usually the royals don't get too much of a choice with who they end up with. But he ditched Blanche 2 days later and then threw her in prison. And then Blanche ended up dying mysteriously in 1361. He then married a third woman, Juana, but was still messing around with Maria the whole time until her death. So, yikes. Though the English-Castilian marriage never happened, Peter continued to have good relations with the English, even once taking refuge with Edward the Black Prince, Edward III's oldest son and heir. The quick story is that Peter was dethroned by his half-brother, who was supported by the French, so it's real messy. But with Peter's death, so too died friendly and purposeful relations between the English and the Castilians in the 14th century. And that is the story of the sad, short, violent life of Princess Joan of England. She was the favorite daughter of one of England's great kings, Edward III, but while en route to her political marriage to Castile, she became a victim of the plague. Perhaps if she had made it, things would have gone differently in the 100 Years' War. But her death did show Europeans in the 14th century something important. The plague should not be underestimated. It kills indiscriminately, and nobody is safe. And for more information about the Black Death, go check out my longer podcast episode all about it. My name is Kelly Beard, and thank you for listening to this AF-Out Mini on the princess who died of plague, Joan of England. If you enjoyed this episode, go check out some of my other minis or my longer podcast episodes, which drop every other Sunday. Make sure to subscribe so you don't miss out on any more bloody, gross, or mysterious, weird stories from history.